let me see here. Yeah, so I'm going to ask you a few questions as well. So feel free to chip in, or if I say something you don't understand, please stop me and I'll try to explain it again in a different sense. Okay, so yeah, week 7a. Thanks for coming here online. We're looking at emergentism today, which is a very popular theory of mind. The plan today is this. I'm going to give you a little recap on how this fits into everything. So context, in other words, the mind-matter problem and options. I'm going to give you a history of emergentism very briefly. I'm going to give some general examples of emergentism in realms other than the mind. Then I'm going to talk about types of emergentism, or like at least 4 types. And then we're going to, most importantly, really look at the features of emergentism, like the essence of emergentism. What makes emergentism that which it is? So that will be novelty, holism, mental causal efficacy or mental causation, irreducibility, theoretical unpredictability, and so-called bridge laws. And then we'll be looking at criticism. So I'll have a list of criticisms, but what ideally, if we have time there, what I'd like you to do, maybe in pairs, we'll see how time goes, is think about counter criticisms to the criticisms I give, so that you could apply that to an essay or an exam. By the way, if you haven't started your essays yet and you're thinking about doing that question on 3 different types of mind-matter relations, then this is included as one of those relations. And on Thursday, we'll be looking at epiphenomenalism as well, which is another type, as we shall see. Okay, but let's put this all into context then and have a little recap. Right, where are we? So you'll recall that the main issue we're looking at is the mind-matter problem, or also known as somebody? Again, sir? Or was that just someone?
Hard problem of consciousness.
Yeah, there you go. Hard problem of consciousness. For brownie points, one more term for it. Less known.
Mind-body problem.
Mind-body problem. Okay, yeah, and the 4th one even I'm thinking about. Yeah, very good. The explanatory gap from Levine. Anyway, yeah, mind-matter problem, mind-body problem, mind-matter mystery is this: what is the relation between mind and matter? So today we're looking at one of the answers for that. Last week or 2 weeks ago, you looked at substance dualism with Irini. That's another relation. And you'll recall here this sort of grid of relations. So you've got substance dualism on the left, then mind and matter, 2 separate substances that interact, perhaps in the pineal gland, as Descartes said. We've got, now you see at the bottom here of this diagram, it says physicalisms. So there's 4 types of materialism or physicalism, which, remember, means that is the belief that the fundamental nature of reality is the physical. What does the physical mean? That which physics understands to be fundamental. So atoms, particles, subatomic particles, fields of force, gravitation, electromagnetism, and so on. Anyway, so there's 4 types of physicalisms here, arguably. Remember, in philosophy, everything's arguable, right? There's eliminativism, which we won't look at in this module. It's just, Galen Strawson called it the silliest claim ever made by mankind. It's the view that there is no phenomenology, no consciousness, no mind. Then there's epiphenomenalism, which we will look at on Thursday in 2 days. And in some people classify epiphenomenalism as a type of emergentism, but we'll see that that shouldn't really be done because of mental causation, as I'll explain. Epiphenomenalism, just quickly, you see the arrows going up, it means that the brain secretes the mind. So like the mind, consciousness, colors of red, emotions, these are all just sort of after effects, epiphenomena of activity in the brain. It does, in other words, it believes that the brain, or rather it believes that the mind emerges from the brain, but it doesn't believe that the mind can have any effect back on the brain and body. Today we'll be looking at emergentism then, which has got the arrow up and down. Why down? Because that's mental causation, which we'll explore even more on Thursday. So these two lessons, by the way, emergentism and mental causation, are sort of interlinked. That's why they're on the same week. Another one we'll look at later on is psychoneural identity theory, which is the view that it's not that the mind emerges from the brain, it's rather that the mind is the brain or certain brain activity. Then there's panpsychism, we'll definitely look at. Like I said, mind and matter are the same thing, generally, including plants. Idealism, we won't look at, and neutral monism we'll have a quick look at. I will talk a bit about idealism if you're particularly interested in it, but it won't be part of the exam. So yeah, today, emergentism. So are there any, first of all, are there any questions about this little menu of mind-matter relations? Obviously, in the module, we're working through them, or working through most of them. Nothing yet? Okay. So emergentism then. Well, a brief history. Emergentism was, except for substance dualism, amongst the academics, intellectuals, emergentism in Britain at least was the sort of was one of the most common ways of thinking about the relation between mind and matter. John Stuart Mill, who philosophy students normally study with regard to the moral theory of utilitarianism, you know, that pleasure is good, pain is bad, very basically. He concocted a theory of emergentism in 1843. George Henry Lewis, who coined emergentism in 1874, Alexander Bain, Samuel Alexander. Samuel Alexander died about 120 years ago. He was at Cambridge, I think. Conwyn Lloyd Morgan was more of a biologist than a philosopher, but was a great proponent of emergentism. And then it sort of ended with British emergentism, at least, ended with a philosopher called C.D. Broad, or Charlie Dunbar Broad, who, by the way, is a fantastic philosopher, very clear writer, very deep at the same time. He wrote this wonderful book called The Mind and Its Place in Nature in 1925. And in there, he puts forward an emergentist theory of mind, part of which I will quote later on today. So emergentism was prevalent in Britain, at least, for 100 years or more. And then in the sort of early 20th century, it sort of faded away a bit. One of the reasons for that was that some of the examples that the British emergentists used, someone's in the waiting room here. Some of the examples, hold on. Some of the examples that we used were actually as emergent phenomena. Some chemical reactions were actually explained with the advent of science in the mid-20th century. So that sort of lost the British emergentists a bit of power. Also, vitalism, which was very popular sort of in the late 19th century, early 20th century. Vitalism is a view that life was not just mechanical, but had a kind of a vital spirit within it, making it move. That was kind of dismissed as well with the continuation, with the advance of science, it was believed. And so emergentism sort of fell out of favor. And then in philosophy, at least, we became very reductivist, and I'll explain that word later on, but it means that we reduced mind away. Psychoneural identity theory, as I mentioned, became big in the 1950s. Eliminativism, as in the form of behaviorism, became very popular in the mid-20th century. The philosophy of language became very popular, and it tried to sort of say that, listen, what you mean by mind or color or joy or sadness, this is really just, it's not a real thing. It's kind of an illusion of language, as it were. With people such as Gilbert Ryle and Wittgenstein, this became very fashionable in philosophy, but also in science. As I mentioned, in the 20th century, consciousness was a bad word in science, for most of it anyway, certainly the middle part. And so British emergentism, was just sort of out out of the limelight. And what was in the limelight? Psychoneural identity theory, as I said, eliminativism and so on, which we'll look at later. Reductive physicalism, that's known as. In other words, everything can be reduced, sort of explained by fully the physical. But in the late 1990s, really, or maybe before that, a lot of problems emerged with these reductive physicalist theories as well, which we'll look at in a few weeks with regard to psychoneural identity theory. So they, it was deemed that these theories were just implausible. And that sort of led to the re-emergence, as it were, of emergentism. So one of the best philosophers on emergentism, though he's skeptical, is Week7a Kim, a Korean-American philosopher, I might have mentioned. He wrote this in 1999 and repeated it 2010. Quote, "It is no undue exaggeration to say that we have been under the reign of emergentism since the early 1970s. So this notion that the brain produces the mind, I think this is a very common notion. If you ask the man on the street what they think about the mind, they'll probably say, well, yeah, it's produced by the brain, right? It emerges from the brain. There are synonyms to emergence, such as produced by the brain or generated by the brain, or the brain gives rise to consciousness, to mind. These all really mean emergentism in a vague sort of way that people don't really understand. But that's generally how, I think that's generally how people, scientists, even neuroscientists even think of the mind and its relation to the brain, to matter, in an emergentist fashion. That's why this lesson actually, although there are some big words to remember, I'm afraid, coming up, it's very important, because once you know this, you can have a good conversation with neuroscientists who are studying consciousness. Week7a Kim says of emergentism, this halfway house is an inherently unstable position. This halfway house is in an inherently unstable position. Hard to say that, isn't it? Why? Well, we'll see why with the criticisms at the end of this. But you can see, although emergentism is generally classified as a type of materialism or physicalism, why? Because without the brain, without matter, you won't have mind. So it's completely determined by the brain, even though it's not completely explained by the brain, as I shall explain in a moment. But it's kind of, it's still, some people say it's dualism, really, isn't it? Because you're saying that there's the mind and there's the brain. They're separate. They're separate properties, but they're still separate, even though you might need the brain. So it's like a bit like substance dualism on the one side, but it's a bit like reductive physicalism on the other side. It's a bit like substance dualism because you have mind and matter, you accept the split, but it's a bit like reductive physicalism because without the physical, you won't have mind at all. With substance dualism, you will have mind and matter. Even if there's no matter, you'll have mind. In other words, if your body dies, your soul will continue to exist. So it is argued. So let's look at emergentism, how it emerged. And what we'll see is that this relation between mind and matter is kind of taken from other examples in life, such as the following. So the classic example is this: water emerges from hydrogen dioxide molecules, H2O molecules. So, and what you should notice here are macro properties, big properties as well, and micro properties, tiny properties. So with water, you have macro properties such as the fact that it's liquid, it's wet. Molecules are not wet or liquid. It's temperate, it has a temperature, molecules don't. It's transparent. Water can freeze or boil, molecules can't, of course, per se. Water expands when frozen. Strangely, actually, it's the only liquid that does that. It has other very strange properties, water as well. Apparently, according to some stuff I've read recently, water really should be a gas, right? And it expands when frozen. Nobody really knows why. Also, it freezes faster. Hot water freezes faster than cold water, was recently discovered, and nobody understands why. So one can say that water emerges from the molecules which have different properties from the water, just like mind apparently has different properties from the brain, as we shall see in a moment. Some people say, in the literature, just quickly say this, even people like David Chalmers, they say that, you know, it was once believed that water emerged from H2O molecules, but now we know that it's not just a brute emergence, we can explain it fully. But actually we can't. So there are more mysteries to water than we realized 50 years ago. Anyway, another example of emergence. We say a rainbow might emerge from sun and rain and other conditions. But of course, a rainbow has different macro properties to that which it comes from. So, for example, rainbow is multicolored. The sun isn't multicolored, the rain isn't multicolored, well, not as multicolored at least. The rainbow is semicircular in shape, the sun is spherical, rain is drop-shaped. The rainbow is non-tangible, you can't touch it, whereas the sun is touchable, although I wouldn't recommend it. And rain you can sort of feel as well, of course. And so we see that here an example of one phenomenon, rainbow, emerging from another. A more abstract example, we might say that the area of a circle emerges from its radius. So the area of a circle, if you hark back to GCSE mathematics, is pi times the radius squared. That's an example of strong emergence, as I'll show later. Another good example that Jerry Fodor wrote about, American philosopher of mind, money. You know, money emerges from metal, paper, but also the whole economic system of markets and belief systems and fractional reserve banking and blah, blah, blah. I mean, it's very complicated, obviously. Economics sometimes I think is more abstract than metaphysics. But anyway, you know, the macro properties of money then is like the fact that money is exchangeable, it has value beyond its matter. In other words, like the value of a £50 note is beyond the value of the paper it's made on or plastic it's made on, the £50 note. It can be, money can be multiply realized. In other words, you know, £50 can be realized with a £50 note, but it can also be realized with £50 coins, or it can be realized on a computer with a transfer, for example. Whereas when you look at the micro properties of any of those multiple realizers, they're very different from the properties of money. So like we say, like, you know, coin, for example, has metallic properties, or a note has paper, plastic properties, on the computer it has its own properties, and so on. The ultimate point, though, is that one phenomenon emerges from something else, and that emergent phenomenon has new properties that you can't discover just by like zooming in on the coin. Now, there are then these multiple other examples of how things emerge within nature. And so the emergentists' general idea is actually by analogy. You know, they say, well, the mind emerging from the brain, it's just like other examples of emergence we get in nature already. So there's nothing surprising, nothing new about it. And, you know, the macro properties of the mind are distinct from the micro properties of the brain, just like money and metal. So, you know, the macro properties of the mind we've looked at in former weeks. So, for example, when we're talking about the contents of sentience or mind, like in that image in the bottom left there, we have qualia, so just to remind you, like colors, sounds, smells, tastes, and so on. Cognition, reason, concept, so on. And then we have these modes of sentience like time, rate, veridicality, focus. And then we also have, if you remember, properties such as privacy and intentionality, which apparently the matter does not have. Now you can immediately see here that when, I know a number of you are doing this essay on privacy and intentionality. If you're critical of those views, that privacy, for example, is only a property of the mind, if you're critical of that, then you could use that criticism here as well, in terms of dividing up mind and matter, mind and brain. The brain has qualities, properties, relations, parts that the mind doesn't seem to have when we analyze it. So the brain has neuron cells, has synaptic transmissions between these cells, it has electrical impulses going through those dendrites and axons there. In other words, like the roots. It has neurotransmitter molecules between synapses. So, molecules like serotonin, dopamine, so on. It can display synchronized firing, or asynchronized firing is related to, it's dependent on blood flow and so on. All of those properties, micro properties as it were, are not, you couldn't really say are essential for understanding what the mind is, even though the mind might be completely determined by those micro properties. I'll give you a more specific example, vision. So you ask some people what's vision, they say, well, it's produced by activity in the visual cortex and the occipital lobe of the brain. So at the back of the brain, the occipital lobe, the visual cortex within that, we've seen via brain imaging that there's a correlation between vision, the phenomenology, the mind, in other words, and the visual cortex, or the physiology. There's a correlation between the phenomenology, mind, and the physiology, the brain. We call this the neural correlates of consciousness. This was big in the 1990s, this term. And we think, okay, well, vision then emerges from that activity. When you read, again, like a lot of neuroscientific papers, you'll get that, like we see that the color green has emerged from these neurons in this part here in the visual cortex or so on. But it's always that little word emerges, which is so problematic, as this lecture will hopefully show. Just say another thing quickly about that. If emergentism is problematic, and if eliminativism is problematic, psychoneural identity theory and eliminativism, emergentism, epiphenomenalism, psychoneural identity theory, they're the four main materialist solutions to the mind matter problem. If they're all very problematic, where does that leave us? I mean, all of the other ones are also problematic. There's no absolutely perfect one, like I say. Anyway, so we say that vision emerges from the occipital lobe. Generally speaking, and I saw this in a conference I was at a few weeks ago. You see it all the time. You get this general emergence, also known as upward causation, by the way, in life, in the world in which we know. This is generally how people picture the hierarchy of our understanding. So at the base level, you get physics, you get atoms, subatomic particles, quantum theory, so on and so forth. Chemistry, it is said, emerges, as it were, from physics. So, atoms coming together create molecules, and then molecules, other kinds of molecules fuse to create reactions of some sort, whatever. And when those interactions become complex, biology emerges from that. So you get, like very basic, viruses, organic molecules, to cells, to organs, to complex organs such as the brain, and then it's believed, and then the mind emerges from that, from complex forms of biology. An interesting question here is, how complex? But how complex does the biology or the physiology or the brain or the body need to be to make emerge the mind, to make emerge psychology? I could have put psychology instead of the mind there. That is an interesting question, and there's no absolute answer to that at the moment. Any questions so far? No, then I shall continue. Okay, so let's now let's sort of get more into this concept of what emergentism is with regard to the mind. So I'm going to look at 4 types of emergentism here, or 4 types of emergence, all of which are parts of emergentism. So we can distinguish strong emergence from weak emergence, and we can distinguish synchronous emergence from diachronic emergence. What do these mean? Okay, strong emergence, less popular. The example of the circles would be an example of that. So strong emergence is when that which emerges has to emerge out of logical necessity. So for example, then, the area of a circle logically necessarily emerges from the radius length. It couldn't be any other way. If you have a radius, you will have of a certain length, you will have an area of a specific, you'll have a specific area. It cannot fluctuate. It couldn't be that one day radius is 1, the area is whatever, the next day the radius is 1, the area is something different. This is logically impossible. Its denial would be a contradiction. So in this case, it's not the case that the area equals pi times radius squared. That would be a contradiction, just like saying a four-sided triangle. It just would not be possible. So if you have this base, radius in this case, you must have the emergent property. But that's not really how emergentism is understood for the mind. Emergentists generally take a weak form of emergence. Now, a weak form of emergence is shown by induction. Induction is the inference of a general law from particular instances. So, for example, if I see light traveling at 300,000 kilometers per second a number of times, I might infer then that light always travels at that speed. And with regard to emergentism, well, if I've seen that this part of the brain lights up in many cases, and in all of those cases, that particular brain activity is correlated to, let's say, the color green, then I will think that, this part of the brain makes emerge the color green. It's not a logical deduction like the area of a circle from the radius. It's not deduction, it's induction. It's just that I've seen it a number of times and I think it's always going to be the case. A general law from particular instances. Science generally gains knowledge this way. It does experiments, sees the same thing happening again and again, and it thus forms laws and knowledge from that. So induction is, you could say, upward inference, general law from particular instances at the bottom. Deduction is the other way down. Once you've got a law, you can then deduce particular instances. So logic uses this, mathematics uses this. Logic has like a particular general law, logic has general laws like the law of contradiction, the law of excluded middle, law of identity, and from these laws, modus ponens, so on, it can deduce certain valid conclusions. But emergentism with regard to the mind and brain works through induction. So we just sort of do the experiments, the correlates, as it were, in brain imaging or brain damage, and we get the idea of emergence. That the mind emerges from certain brain activity is induced then by comparing mental reports with brain imaging and brain damage, and by inferring an emergent relation between mind and brain. So that's why it's weak emergence. Why is it weak? Again, another way of looking at this is the following. It's not a contradiction. It's actually not logically impossible to conceive such brain activity without an emergent mind. So one can actually conceive of zombies, for example, right? This is an argument used in philosophy sometimes by David Chalmers and others. The zombie argument, it's this, that, we can conceive of human bodies exactly like ours, but they have got no mentality at all. That's conceivable. Whereas a triangle with 4 sides is not conceivable. It's a contradiction. It's an oxymoron, it's contradiction terms. But we can conceive of zombies. So therefore, we can conceive of brains with the relevant brain activity which don't have a correlate mental aspect. Now, though we can imagine it, doesn't mean it can happen. But nonetheless, what it means is that the relation is not logically absolute, like radius and area. One problem generally with induction, one weakness of it, why it's weak emergence, is Hume's problem of induction. Has anyone ever come across this before, the problem of induction? No, I'll take that as a no. Well, it's this, that no matter how, very basically, no matter, David Hume, by the way, was a Scottish philosopher, and very influential. Anyway, his problem of induction is this: no matter how many times you see something constantly correlated, like light and its speed, or water boiling at 100 degrees, no matter, or whatever, or freezing at 0 degrees, no matter how many times you see this happen, it doesn't mean that it will always happen in the future. You just assume it will happen in the future, but you can't be sure because you don't know that the future resembles the present or the past. You can't see the future, therefore it cannot be very empirically verified. So anyway, so emergentism as a result of these things takes a weak form, a contingent form, it's known as well. Most emergentists adopt weak emergence. There are a few who say, no, this is absolutely logically necessitated, but they are rare. A third, so that was the second type of emergentism. Strong, well, first, strong and weak. The third one is now synchronous emergence, which is generally what emergentists hold as well. So they generally hold 2 and 3, and 4, I suppose. Actually, no, parts of 4. With this synchronous emergence, synchronous means occurring at the same time, simultaneous, concurrent. So emergentism is generally the view that mental events are synchronous with the underlying or the subvenient, that means that which underlies, neural events. So, you know, in my images before that I've just shown you, the sort of green circle's mind, the blue square is matter. These happen at the same time, T1, that's instant 1, that they're synchronous. We don't think first something happens in matter and then like 5 seconds later the mental event occurs. We believe that they happen at the same time. I'll just quickly say something about that, well, why that would be, relates to the next slide as well. Someone asked this in class a few weeks ago as well, I remember. Why can't it be that the brain sort of does something and then a few seconds later it becomes part of like your awareness? Well, maybe that is what happens in certain cases. However, how can it be that if you the danger of that is it sort of tilts towards dualism, substance dualism almost, because how could there be a bit of mind, let's say, some fear? Let's say there's a brain activity, and then a few seconds later, that brain activity causes fear. I mean, that prior brain activity causes mental fear. So you have brain activity, 1, 2, 3, then you have feel of fear. That would not be synchronous, but diachronic, the third type of diachronic. Happening over time. The sort of problem with that is that it would mean that there's a mental state which sort of is floating without an anchor, right? It's like it would exist without at the time, at T1 or T2 or whatever, having any physical subvenient base. So it would almost be, and then in that case, if it happened afterwards, it would almost be as if the brain created dualism. Whereas if it's synchronous, every part of the mind then is determined by an aspect of the brain, activity of the brain. That is something that we can discuss later if you like. The fourth type of emergentism is diachronic emergence, which I mentioned. So diachronic means occurring over a period of time. Emergentism, the third meaning there is what I've just spoken about, is that mind emerges because of, but after its determining brain activity. So I'll leave that for now. But there are other forms, so that's controversial. The first two, though, are not controversial. And they're generally believed in, I think, by most people, at least in Britain. So emergentism also holds a diachronic view that at some instance in the development of the universe, mind suddenly emerged from non-mind, from the physical. So in other words, the view is this, and we'll come back to this in the criticism. The universe, well, maybe there was a Big Bang. This is now questioned by physicists apparently, but let's assume it 14 billion years ago or so. There's a Big Bang. Sort of plasma, subatomic particles developed, into molecules and so on. Then, stars and planets started developing. And maybe, on certain planets, there was water, or other liquids. And that helped develop very complex molecules, which started forming into primitive forms of life, like viruses, bacteria, so on. And then at some point, so at some instant in the history of the universe, boom, mind emerged. By mind, I don't mean like, human consciousness, remember, I'm not talking about, anxieties about essay deadlines and stuff like that. I'm talking about like maybe just a basic desire for food, what would be something similar to food, something that would help you survive, or a basic fear of not surviving, a basic valence, in other words. And also, I should say, a basic perspective. Suddenly there's a perspective on the world. This is another form. In other words, it's the belief that mind emerged out of a non-mental universe over time. I think most people believe that, even though there's no evidence for it. But how can you have evidence of the past? Of course, general problem with evolutionary psychology and so on. You can't get back in time to find out. Anyway, that's one form of diachronic emergence. Also, emergentism also has the view that the mind emerges from non-mind physiology during gestation, during pregnancy. So in other words, this diachronic emergentism is happening all the time. First of all, there's a zygote embryo, and then at some point, mind pops into existence, it is believed, in the embryo. When is a very interesting and important question, if there is a when. It has ethical, political ramifications. This theoretical stuff does, right? So, in terms of abortion, for example, I think abortion laws in Britain are based on the view that an embryo can feel pain at a certain stage in its development. How this is determined, I think it's very ambiguous how anyone would determine this. But if emergentism was true, and we did find out that, a week, 10 or whatever, basic forms of sentience emerge into, as it were, a embryo, because its brain is complex enough, then that would have, one would presume, ethical repercussions, wouldn't it? The law, just related to this, the law in Britain recently changed to protect crabs, lobsters, and octopuses from certain forms of cruelty. So, it's now illegal, I think, to boil an octopus alive. I mean, you have to kill it anyway, I suppose. I don't know how that helps much. I suppose being boiled alive is probably worse than other forms of killing. But anyway, it's been by these philosophers, I think it's King's College, is it? Anyway, doing this report for the government, they think that it's more likely than not that lobsters, crabs, and octopuses are sentient. Now, why they would have thought that they're not sentient, why that's a default position is an interesting question itself. I mean, like, you could say, well, we need proof that they're not sentient rather than that they are sentient. But nonetheless, this is how the British law has changed recently. So questions about emergentism of mind are politically valuable. Who knows where this picture comes from, by the way? It comes from the film 2001: Space Odyssey. Right, any questions so far before we get on to the next part? No? Okay, let's move on then. We'll take a break, I think, in 10 minutes. Okay, now we're going to look at, so we've looked at examples of emergentism in nature. We've looked at 4 different types of emergentism: strong, weak, synchronous, diachronic. But now we're going to look at the main part, which is, what emergentism really is, if it is anything. And we can divide these features into 5. And they're all interrelated, very interrelated, and some really overlap. But anyway, you divide things in order to explain them, Bear in mind that for the essays. So these 5 features are the following: novelty, that means newness; holism, wholeness; mental causal efficacy, or mental causation, that's what we're going to focus on Thursday; fourthly, irreducibility, or theoretical unpredictability. I'll explain that in a moment. And fifthly, bridge laws, or as they're known, transordinal nomology. So let's start with novelty. The truly emergent, as opposed to the resultant, I'll explain that in a second, has properties different to that from which it emerged, different to the subvenient base, like the neural activity. That is, these emerging properties are novel. They do not exist pre-emergence. So as we saw before, we have the micro and the macro properties. And those macro properties, those bigger properties, as it were, that are noticeable by us humans, they are emergent, colors and so on. And that means that they did not exist before. So when we think about the emergence of the mind, emergence of sentience, all of these things didn't exist in matter before. They're something that are completely novel. There are, in other words, it's kind of strange in a way that a certain level of complexity makes emerge something completely different to itself, or very different to itself. This is the emergentist belief. This can be opposed, for example, to the panpsychist belief, which believes that these things are not emergent. Like panpsychists believe that mind always existed, never emerged into reality at some point. But emergentists favor this. These are novel properties. Again, qualia, privacy, so on. Consider these contents and differentiators of mind from matter from week 4 then, as the novel properties that emerge from the underlying brain. So yeah, like I say, qualia, somatic feelings like pain. Did pain exist before complex organisms existed? Will, cognition, reason, concepts, time rate, the speed of time, privacy, intentionality, causal efficacy, as we'll see below. These are, so that's one key feature, characteristic of emergentism, that something new comes into being, something new comes into existence that never existed before. Secondly, less important, but still holism, which means that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Let me just go back, actually, one thing I didn't explain fully. I opposed emergent to resultant. This is what the British idealists differentiated. So we can say that something is resultant if it's fully predicted by what it's caused by. So like, for example, a brick wall, as I'm going to talk about now, is resultant from bricks. There's nothing really new in a brick wall. The concept is new, but the actual thing is a result of bricks and mortar and concrete and whatever. There's nothing new there. There's nothing, the brick wall doesn't really bring anything new into existence that hadn't already existed in smaller parts. Bricks existed, concrete existed, and so on. Whereas this is different from the mind. Because it seems that you can't say that again, curiosity existed within cells, for example. So anyway, holism, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Paul Humphreys, in his book Emergence, he wrote, quote, emergent phenomena, things, are traditionally differentiated from what are called aggregate phenomena. So a brick wall is an aggregate phenomenon. It's just an aggregate, a collection of bricks. It's resultant. It's an aggregate phenomenon. Aggregate phenomena are resultant, whereas emergent phenomena are not resultant. They are emergent, and that means they're holistic. A mind, for example, is more than an aggregate of brain flesh, understood as such. You can't. A brick wall is different from a brain in this sense, or a brain mind in this sense. You can't understand what a brain completely sufficiently is by taking it apart and looking at each of the parts, like each of the neurons, each of the parts of the brain, and so on. Whereas you can understand a wall by taking it apart. You can understand, it seems, a clock by taking it apart. If you see all the cogs, wheels, springs, and so on of a clock, and you understand how it all fits together, you can predict what it will be, what it does. It tells the time. It seems you can't do that with a brain. You can't, or somewhat, without knowing that there's a correlation. You can't take it apart and see how it all fits together and creates, the mind, makes emerge the mind. So in other words, the mind is holistic, whereas a brick wall is not. Third, and probably the most important feature of emergentism is mental causal efficacy, or mental causation. It means the same thing. Causal efficacy simply means power to instigate a change. In other words, it just means power, that the mind has power. Plato said, the sophist, to exist is to have causal efficacy. To exist is to exert power. In other words, if something exists, it has to have some kind of, it must do something. It must have an effect upon something. It plays some role in reality. If we accept Plato's eleactic principle, it would mean that if the emergent mind comes into existence, it must have causal efficacy, otherwise it wouldn't exist. There must be, in other words, mental causation, as we'll see on Thursday. But the strange thing here is, so you can say that mental causation is an aspect, the most important aspect of novelty, but I emphasize it because it's the most powerful thing and the most problematic thing. With mental causation, just briefly, what it means is, like desire causes you to walk to the pub, or love makes you go to your girlfriend or boyfriend's house, or hatred makes you walk away from something, or conscious calculation makes you write down something, these are all forms of mental causation. If that exists, then with the emergence of mind, a new force is created, like mentality as a force, not in the Jedi sense, in the general sense, that suddenly, I mean, think about this cosmically once again, in terms of diachronic causation. There was a universe where everything moved according to the laws of physics, whatever they are, and according to where each particle, each field was. This is how the universe moved. But then, with the emergence, the alleged emergence of consciousness, of mind, suddenly there were other forces at play in the universe. Suddenly a desire for something caused a certain movement. It wasn't just caused by something hitting it or whatever. It suddenly, a form of agency was created. Now you can see why a lot of people don't want to accept mental causation, because it just doesn't make scientific sense, really. There are four forces known to to science at the moment, again, gravity, electromagnetism, strong and weak nuclear force. Maybe there are other forces, but science doesn't know them. But mental causation is not a known force of nature. So we might say, well, surely then mental causation, free will, by the way, is a type of mental causation. Surely it can't exist. It doesn't exist. It must be an illusion. It must be an illusion that is created by our brains. Well, maybe that's true, but you've got this immediate problem there, which is that in order to say that mental causation is an illusion that emerges from our brains, you must believe in upward causation. Mind is caused by brain. But if you accept upward causation, why not downward causation? We'll look at this more on Thursday. Mental causation as well is very important, again, ethically, politically, personally, because it really is about who you are, whether you are a free agent in this world or whether you're completely determined by your genes, epigenetics, the way you've been brought up, your cultural conditioning, and so on. Do you think that you're completely a slave to these external forces, or do you think there's an internal force as well? And that internal force would be mental causation. If it was your body only, that's still then in the, that's still being moved by physical forces. Do you believe that you have some agency over your own life, over your beliefs, over your behavior? If you haven't, then that immediately, as we sort of mentioned briefly before, that has implications for the legal system, doesn't it? No one is therefore guilty of anything. You can't blame anyone for anything. At the same time, you can't praise them for anything either. You can appreciate, good deeds and so on, but you can't really say it's due to them. Anyway, so mental causation, very important. And emergentists, as I say, want to say that what emerges is a new force, mental causal force, efficacy. They want to say this because they want to avoid epiphenomenalism, which is a view that there's no mental causation, but there's only upward emergence, upward causation, but not downward causation. This is what most emergentists, all emergentists really, according to this definition, want to accept. But as we'll see, it's very hard to accept it if you're an emergentist with this physicalist base. Just to remind you, you've seen this image before, but I will use it throughout, mental causation. So we've got two main forms of mental causation. There's mental to mental, the green arrow, the top arrow there. So a thought to a thought, an emotion to an emotion, like hatred leads to envy, for example. Don't know why I'm thinking all these negative examples. So that's mental to mental causation. That's one form of mental causal efficacy. And the purple line going diagonally down is mental to physical causation or psychophysical causation. That's a type of downward causation. Both of those, green and purple, are examples of mental causation. The blue one is just an example of physical causation. So like neuron 1 firing to neuron 2 firing, for example. But again, Thursday, we'll talk about this in more detail. Right. It's 5:30, so I'm going to give you a 10-minute break, make a cup of tea or whatever. Right, I'm back. 2 minutes. Any questions whilst we wait? What are these questions here? Some question in the, does this mean it considers my brain to be from the same underlying? So there's a question here. Hi, Peter, I just have some questions. Does this mean emergentism considers the mind and brain to be from the same underlying substance? Yes, essentially it does. So the brain comes from the substance that is matter, The mind comes from the brain, and as the brain comes from matter, it would be the same underlying substance. That's why really one can say that emergentism is material monism. It's physical monism. It's physicalism. Although, like I say, some people question it because it seems that from this material monism, something else emerges, like a dualism. Also, but generally, though, emergentists will say, in principle, it comes from the same underlying substance. But you can criticize emergentism this way, but that's what they say. Also, you mentioned in diachronic emergence how the mind has just popped out over time. Would this be similar problem criticism as the interaction problem, substance dualism? It's I wouldn't say it's the same. I'd say it's similar. So the interaction problem cuts both ways. How does interaction problem essentially is like, how does is upward and downward causation, essentially. So how does the brain affect the mind if the mind in substance dualism is not material at all? And in turn, how does the mind interact with the brain if it's not physical at all? How can it push anything? How can it move anything? So the diachronic emergence, the cosmic diachronic emergence, is just a problem of upward causation. Downward causation becomes a problem later for it, whereas interaction problems up and down. So there's that difference. Also, the interaction problem is, based on a dualism, whereas the diachronic emergence is allegedly based on a monism. Good questions. I hope you were there to hear it. Did you hear that? The person who did it? Well, let me know in direct message. Someone else, is it okay to talk about occasionalism for the second essay question, even though we haven't talked about it in depth? Well, yes, if you want to study that, that's good. That's fine. If you're confident about that, but I will speak to you about it if you'd like me to. Yes, the person heard it. Very good. I hope it answered your question. Very good question. Any other questions whilst we're here? I love questions. Online again. I know we did this. Well, I did this for 2 years, but it's like almost like I'm speaking to myself, although I know you're there. Right. Okay, let's continue. Share screen. Can somebody just tell me that they can see that?
I can see you.
Thank you. There's another question here. You said to do a formative essay outline. Does that mean we can submit our outline and get fee? Yes, by the way, about a number of people have done this already. If you want to give me like a little outline of your essay before you start writing it, a little structure, do send that to me and I will give you my comments, as I have done now a number of times to a number of students. I think there's one student who I need to get back to. I'll get back to you tomorrow, probably. Or we can talk about it on Thursday as well when I come in. But yes, that's right. So do send me your essay structures if you want me to check them, okay? Right. So we just looked at the third feature, mental causation. Now we're going to look at the fourth one, which is irreducibility, or theoretical unpredictability. So apologies for these big words, big terms. I'll explain it and let me know if you don't understand what it means, although they're a little bit ambiguous. Reducibility is spoken of a lot in philosophy and science. And it just means, well, very basically, it means trying to explain something you don't know in terms of things you do know, like making the unfamiliar familiar. Really, it means that something can be, how do you do that? Well, it means that something can be broken up and fully explained by its parts. So, for example, temperature. You've got a picture of a thermometer there. Temperature can be reduced to the motion of particles or to radiation levels, but let's just stick to particles, right? So in other words, the faster particles move, the higher the temperature is. I'm sure you've done that in GCSE science, yes? Just a quick little question. Why is it better to use temperature than the word heat there? Why do you think I did not use, say, heat can be reduced to the motion of particles? Any thoughts on that?
Because heat is a qualia.
Good. Excellent. Heat is a qualia. You feel heat, right? But temperature seems to be a bit more neutral. I just say that because a lot in the literature, there's a lot of literature like this book. I don't know if you can see this. That book. They always talk about heat and molecular motion, but heat is qual. So it's not a good example. Temperature is better. Anyway, so we can reduce temperature down to movement of particles, or, you know, like wave frequencies, two kinds of heat really. Irreducibility, non-reducibility, means that something cannot be broken into parts and thus cannot be explained this way. Whoops, what's going on here? So this is what, so we see that temperature is resultant, not emergent, of particle motion. Again, it's reducible, so it is resultant. So resultant and reducible go hand in hand. Emergent and irreducible go hand in hand. You can't, it seems again that you cannot break the mind into parts to understand how it came into being, like you can with temperature. You can't break, you know, will, emotions, or parts of the brain. You can't say that, well, because the mind is determined by the brain, we can break up the brain to understand how it all fits together. It seems to be not possible. Why? Because it goes back to novelty. Novel properties emerge from complexity, physical complexity. Whereas with temperature, it's not a novel, it's not a new phenomena. It's just the same, is a difference in kind. No, it's a difference. Resultant means a difference in degree, like something moving faster, many molecules moving faster, whereas emergent is a difference in kind. These are terms that philosophers like to use: difference in degree, difference in kind. The emergent is, yeah, the emergence of novelty, and novelty is a different kind of thing. Now, reducibility is goes hand in hand with predictability. So one can predict temperature from particle motion, you know, if you've got the right equipment and so on. You know. But an emergent mental state is said by emergentists to be emergent, not resultant, and so is theoretically unpredictable. And that's why emergentism is classified as a non-reductive physicalism. You can't reduce the mind to its physical parts. Reductive physicalism, you do reduce the mind to physical parts, like the identity theory, it's the same thing, or eliminativism, you just reduce it away into the brain. It's a non-reductive physicalism, whereas most things in science are reductive, it seems, but not always, like water, maybe is an exception, as I said. I say theoretically unpredictable. But you might say, in retort, you might say, but can't we predict? Can't we predict someone's mental state by looking at their brain activity, you know? Just like we look at the motion of a particles, and we predict the temperature. So can't we do the same with the mind, you know? We look at the brain scan, the brain imaging. We see that this stuff is going on in the mental lobe and the occipital lobe, and then we predict that a vision is seen or whatever. Well, yes and no. So this is where another important distinction comes into play. There are two types of predictability here. There's inductive predictability, which means this: one induces the emergence of something from constant correlations. So, for example, one correlates vision to activity in the visual cortex. Every time someone says, I see green, you see this bit of the brain light up. Well, then inductively, induction, remember, means that you see something happen a number of times. Then you predict that the next time you'll see that brain activity, that vision of greenness occurs as well, right? But you do not know why it's correlated. So therefore, its inductive prediction is not a sufficient explanation. Whereas with temperature, a sufficient explanation, like an adequate explanation of temperature, is simply the motion of the particles, right? That's enough. That explains it all. That totally explains it. But you haven't explained greenness by the activity in the cortex, visual cortex. So there's inductive predictability and there's theoretical predictability. So we can inductively predict what someone will experience, like greenness, from brain scans, but you will not be able to theoretically predict it, which means the following. One infers the emergence of something from knowing all the properties of that from which it emerges. So if one knew everything about the solar system, for example, one could theoretically predict a solar eclipse. So theoretical prediction is sufficient explanation, whereas inductive prediction is not a sufficient explanation. So in theory, one could predict, let's think about the bat here. Let me read this first. Emergentists believe that the mind emerging from brain activity is inductively predictable. So you see brain activity, you predict that they're seeing green, but it's not theoretically predictable. That means that you can't predict greenness from knowing everything there is to know about neurons and brain activity, physiology, neurology, and so on. This is brought out better if you think about non-humans like bats. And this is related to Thomas Nagel's famous essay, which is on the reading list, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? From the 1970s. And I have mentioned this before. So you will not be able to predict what it's like to be a bat, like bat consciousness, by knowing everything there is to know about a bat's physiology or neurology. You might be a complete bat expert. I'm sure there's a name for that. But yet you wouldn't know what, because a bat's brain is different from our own brain, you wouldn't know exactly what that activity meant. A better example, really, maybe I should have used a picture of an octopus, you know. We think that octopuses, well, the British law, like I said, believe that octopuses have sentience now. But an octopus's brain, as I'm sure I mentioned, is very distinct from a human brain. 2/3 are in its arms, completely different shape, setup. So let's say you were an octopus expert. What's the name for that? Anyone? You wouldn't be able to theoretically predict what an octopus sees, or how it sees, or what type of qualia it has. You wouldn't be able to theoretically predict that. You could inductively predict behavior from an octopus, but there's not enough information within the neurology of an octopus to predict what it's like to be an octopus. Now, if you were to explain this in an exam or essay, you might want to say, really, is there really a difference between theoretical and inductive predictability? Something we talk about later. Some people, determinists, usually determinists are contrasted to libertarians, people who believe in free will. Determinists, and many scientists are determinists, many people are determinists, believe that everything is theoretically predictable, everything. So the belief is that if you knew enough about the cause of something, you would perfectly be able to predict its effect. So if we perfectly knew everything about the brain, we would then know enough to predict exactly what kind of qualia emerges from it. One way to think about this is through these demon and archangel thought experiments. One's very famous, Laplace's demon. C.D. Broad's archangel is less famous. I've added an extra reading to this tile. You can read it in detail if you like. Has anyone ever heard of Laplace's demon? When I say famous, or maybe I just mean amongst philosophers. No? Okay, well, it's this. Imagine this. This is from Laplace, then, scientist, a French scientist from 1814. Very, very influential. Quote, "We may regard the present state of the universe as the effect of its past and the cause of its future. An intellect," now people call it a demon for some reason, an intellect which at a certain moment would know all forces that set nature in motion and all positions of all items of which nature is composed, like all particles. So in other words, this demon knows how all the forces work, the laws of nature, and where every particle is and every field of force is. If this intellect were also vast enough to submit these data to analysis, that could compute them, it would embrace in a single formula the movements of the greatest bodies of the universe, the stars and so on, and those of the tiniest atom. For such an intellect, nothing would be uncertain, and the future, just like the past, would be present before its eyes. This is theoretical predictability. So in theory, not in practice, but in theory, if you had a demon, an intellect, a god, you might say, who's omniscient, or you might even say today some kind of supercomputer who just knew the location of everything and the laws of everything, the laws of nature, then surely that computer, that intellect, that demon would be able to predict exactly what would happen, you know. Therefore, in this case, there's no space for mental causation at all. It's not like you can choose what will happen. This has already been foreseen. Whatever will happen would have been foreseen by this demon. Does anyone empathize with that view? Is it one person?
No.
Yes. Okay, we've got one supporter, right? Now, this can be contrasted, I say, to C.D. Broad's Archangel, which is an emergentist thought experiment. So the first one was a sort of reductive physicalist thought experiment, the demon, and now this is an emergentist thought experiment, very similar but has a twist. So C.D. Broad, this great British philosopher, he said this, quote, in 1925, a mathematical archangel, so he it's like an intellect again, would know exactly what the microscopic structure of ammonia must be. But he would be totally unable to predict that a substance with a structure must smell as ammonia does when it gets to the human nose. So smell, of course, is a type of qualia. But it would know all about ammonia, the chemical itself. The utmost this archangel could predict on the subject would be that certain changes would take place in the mucous membrane, the olfactory nerves, nasal nerves, and so on. But he could not possibly know that these changes would be accompanied by the appearance of a smell in general, or of the peculiar smell of ammonia in particular, unless someone told him so, or he had smelled it for himself. If the existence of the so-called secondary qualities, now that means basically qualia, or the fact of their appearance depends on the microscopic movements and arrangement of material particles which do not have these qualities themselves, so in other words, the molecules don't have the smell, the property of the smell, then the laws of this dependence are certainly of the emergent type. So, the argument here is, even if you knew everything there was to know about everything physical, you still wouldn't be able to predict a certain smell from the movement of atoms, molecules, neurons, and so on. Not even the greatest intellect. Why? Because the emergent creates something novel, which is unpredictable. Something new emerges from something different in kind. That's the argument anyway. Now, this argument has a different sort of formulation, and it's very famous, another famous philosophical thought experiment called Mary's Room. And it also goes by the name of the knowledge argument. Did I ever mention the Mary's Room to you before? Just say no.
No.
No. Okay. So Mary's Room is then it was devised by a philosopher called Frank Jackson in the 1980s. He wrote 2 papers about it. I've got extracts on the link on the tile you can read if you like, but I've got an extract here as well. I'm not going to read that for you now. I'm going to summarize it. So the argument is this, and it relates to this archangel. And now I just try to focus on this because this comes in as a criticism of emergentism, strangely, later. So the argument is this: imagine that there's this neuroscientist called Mary, and she, like, as you can see on that picture I made there, she knows everything. She knows everything there is to know about the color red in terms of brain physiology, right? In terms of neurology. She's a neuroscientist, expert neuroscientist. There's nobody else. She fully understands that when you see the color red, this activity happens in the brain. She knows it in terms of neurons, atoms, you know, everything, pharmacology, whatnot. But, and here's the twist, someone's joining us now, it's a bit late, isn't it? Mary has never seen the color red in her life. She's lived all her life in this very lovely black and white room. Now, so the question becomes, does Mary know what redness is? She knows all the physical facts about redness, but she's never experienced redness. She's never seen a red apple, a red tomato, whatever. The argument that Frank Jackson makes is that when she steps outside the room and sees for the first time, let's say, a red apple, she suddenly says, aha, that's what red is. She gains knowledge. And now in turn, the argument is that this means that physicalism, this idea, this metaphysic we saw, physicalism can't be true because there must be non-physical facts. In other words, seeing red. She knew all the physical facts related to red, but she'd never experienced it. So therefore, there must be facts beyond physicalism, which is really a refutation of physicalism, because physicalism thinks all facts are physical. You can read that in your own time. There's a PDF, of course, on the early page. There's a similar point was made by Bertrand Russell about 100 years ago. He wrote this: there will remain a certain sphere which will be outside physics. It is obvious that a man who can see knows things which a blind man cannot know. But a blind man can know the whole of physics. So that's, again, an argument against physicalism or materialism, which we can discuss. It's all that argument's called the knowledge argument, and it, although yeah, you can see it in Bertrand Russell and other philosophers, Frank Jackson made it popular in the 1980s, and then since then there have been like hundreds of or if not thousands of papers about it, and Frank Jackson himself doesn't believe in it anymore, interestingly, although I think Frank Jackson's criticism of it, of his own theory, is pretty awful. Like possibly the worst criticism you can have. It's very odd. Anyway, but the interesting thing here for us, I think, is that Mary's room, emergentism claims for the most to be a physicalist theory, right? As we said, everything's determined by the physical brain. All mental phenomena in emergentism are created and determined, though not explained, in other words, not reduced or theoretically predicted by physical activity. So remember, emergentism is physicalism because it thinks without the brain, without the physical body, there can be no mind. So that means that the brain determines the mind. The brain makes emerge the mind. But the brain, knowing the brain alone, is not enough to predict what the mind will be. Therefore, you can't explain the mind simply by the brain, even though the brain creates it, right? But wait a minute, so emergentism is supposed to be a type of physicalism, but when you look at emergentism in detail, it seems to lead to Mary's room, right? Which seems to be sort of a refutation of physicalism, something to consider. The fifth feature of emergentism is bridge laws, so-called bridge laws, also known as transordinal nomology. But bridge law is a bit simpler, isn't it? So it's this: if the mental emerges from the physical, the brain, then one would expect there to be some kind of laws, like scientific laws, that bridge the mental with the physical, the gap that connects them, that bridges them. C.D. Broad, in that 1925 book I mentioned, differentiates intraordinal laws. So an order, ordinal, means like the physical order, the mental order, right? Or we can think of orders like that triangle before, you know, the physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, right? Anyway, so Broad says that there are intraordinal laws. So in the physical and the physics, we have laws of physics. And there are laws of chemistry, laws of biology. Interesting question is if they're reducible to physics. But how about laws that not just go, laterally, horizontally, but that go vertically, so matter to mind. The laws of nature that we know in science are intraordinal, intra within the physical domain, physical to physical. Emergentism would have to posit transordinal nomology. Nomology means theory of laws, bridge laws, in other words, that connect the two orders of the physical and the mental. But you know what? If there are such laws, they are not part of current science. We don't have those laws. We can't apply them to a bat's brain, for example. Does this make emergentism physicalist yet unscientific? Another question to ponder. Okay, now we go to the criticisms. Now, the way I'm going to do this, we've got 20 minutes almost. I'm going to go through one criticism, and then I'm going to ask you for a counter criticism, if you're willing to give it. So just think on your feet, it doesn't matter. I'm just happy to hear any kind of ideas here. So the first criticism is, emergentism assumes the differentiators between the mental and the physical, mind and matter, like that one from Fiegel. So let me ask you, do you think that's a fair criticism? Or do you think you can counter that? So the criticism again is that, well, you've assumed that the mental is subjective, physical is objective, or non-spatial, spatial, or purposive, mechanical, or private, public, intentional, non-intentional. How could you give a counter criticism to that criticism? Or do you think it's fair? Who thinks that's a fair criticism?
I mean, each of those differentiators has its own criticisms, and I mean, the way that you put each differentiation kind of, like if you made it so that the criteria are kind of in a different way, kind of like you were saying with like the morning star and the evening star, they're still the same, but people thought that they were different because it was in the morning and the evening, but they were actually the same. So like, you can change the criteria around as much as you want, but yeah, that kind of makes sense.
Excellent. Yeah, good. So if you criticize those differentiations as merely now take note of these words, as merely epistemic, in other words, to do with our knowledge of things, rather than ontological, to do with the reality of things. Like you're saying, the morning and the evening star, epistemically different concepts, but they're actually ontologically the same thing. Venus, planet Venus, might be the same for these differentiators, right? In which case, you can't say that something novel emerges from something else. You can't say there's a jump in novelty, because actually what you've done in this case is you've conflated, or rather you've thought that the physical is less than it actually is, so maybe the physical does have a private aspect, or maybe the mental has a public aspect, as you were saying, so that's one criticism of emergentism is that you can that it assumes that these differences between mind and matter are actual. And certainly with the essays at the moment, at least those doing privacy and intentionality, you can see how that's problematic. A second criticism, which I've sort of mentioned, bridge laws, transordinal nomology, are not scientific laws. They're not laws of nature. Of course, just because they're not known laws of nature doesn't mean they do not exist. It means, as we've seen before, science advances all the time, progresses, or at least it shifts, as paradigm shifts at least, but doesn't mean that scientists adopting, does this not mean though, at the moment though, that scientists adopting emergentism, claiming to be scientific, may be mistaken? In other words, they're mistaken that they have scientific beliefs. Again, look out for synonyms of emergence in neuroscientific papers, such as generates, produces, gives rise to. Every time I hear these words, like generated, then the brain generates this phenomenology. I immediately think that little one word, that word you generate or produces or gives rise to, makes emerge, that, as we've seen in these last 1.5 hours, 2 hours, that means a lot, and actually means many different things, different types of emergentism, has got all these problems. And it doesn't seem to be part of science generally. So you could say that, a lot of people who think they're being scientific by being emergentist are not really being scientific. But as I say, such bridge laws may one day become part of science. There would be a big shift if that is what science would incorporate, of course. But that is then what is known as like promissory materialism. You think, well, I can't explain it now, but surely it must be like that in the future. Third one I've mentioned with regard to Hume. Okay, how about this criticism? Bridge laws are not scientific. How could you counter-criticize that? I've sort of given some counter-criticisms here already, I suppose. Anyone want to add anything else to that or ask a question about it? Or ask a question about what a bridge law means? No, let's move on then. Here's a stronger, harsher criticism. Emergence of mind from matter is simply magic, miracle, miraculous. Maybe you've seen this cartoon before. Blah, blah, blah. It would be like, brain activities like that. Then a miracle occurs. That's emergence. And then blah, 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 then you got the mind, doing this. I think you should be more explicit here in step 2, the figure says. We've said what emergence, the features of emergence, novel, has mental causation, but we haven't really said, because no one really knows what emergence is, right? How does it happen? Like if you can't predict the effect from the cause, it's theoretically unpredictable. Then, although you might think you see it occur, you don't see it. You can't empirically see emergence. You can trace a rainbow, say, through the refraction of light, sunlight into raindrops and so on. You can follow the causal path. You can't with emergence. You can't see something move up. Of course, upward causation is a spatial metaphor, it's not really going up in any sense. It's just sort of changing order. But you can't see it occur. All you can perceive are correlations between mind and brain. But you do not perceive emergence. I mean, even with a substance dualist belief, you'd expect correlations, or with neutral monism, or with psychoneural identity, you would expect. In fact, all of those options for mind-matter relation, they would always expect correlation of mind and matter with them. But you don't see. The reason it's a mystery, the problem, is because you don't see that relation move. You can't trace a line, as it were, upwards. Sewell Wright, a scientist, he was a founder of population genetics. He wrote this in 1977. Now, this is also criticism about it being magic, but in this case, in terms of synchronous emergence of mind from matter, in other words, happening at the same time. Quote, the evolution of a new organ, like a heart, involves nothing more mysterious than differential growth. Emergence of this kind, as resultant emergence, like evolution of organs, poses no serious philosophical difficulty. Emergence of mind from no mind at all is sheer magic. We conclude that the evolution of mind must have been coextensive with the evolution of the body. Moreover, mind must already have been there when life arose, and indeed must be a universal aspect of existence, still assuming that mind cannot arise from nothing. End quote. So in other words, he's saying that emergence of mind from no mind is just magic, because it's like it's a creatio ex nihilo, which means creation out of nothing. You're getting mind from non-mind. It's really like magic. You're creating something from something that does not exist. It can't be the case. Any comments or counter criticisms of that?
So does this also mean that like having the physical world without having the physical world first, like is also rejecting the fact that the physical world is like kind of generates itself, or like whatever, however it exists.
Well, it doesn't reject that the physical it's not rejecting sort of the emergence of complexity in physical systems. So, you know, the evolution of organisms and the evolution of planets and stars and so on from elementary forces and laws of nature. He says that poses no serious philosophical difficulty. But what he's saying is that the next step, you know, the last step on that pyramid that we saw at the beginning, that is not the same as the other ones. It's not the same as chemistry from physics or biology from chemistry. It's something completely different. Because, you know, chemistry involves the particles of physics, and biology involves the particles or the cells of chemistry, or not the cells, the sort of organic molecules. But mind doesn't involve as its essence the organs of biology. It's as we've seen, it seems to be something very different. So he concludes that the evolution of the mind must have been coextensive with the evolution of the body. What that really means is this: he thinks that is panpsychism really here. So it's the view that mind didn't suddenly come into existence with some complex matter. Rather, it was always there, but there were just basic forms of mind with basic forms of matter, complex forms of mind with complex forms of matter. Here's something else Sewell writes about diachronic emergence of human mind as being magic as well. This is related to pregnancy. Quote, the emergence of mind in the course of individual development from the fertilized egg presents a similar problem, and one that is an everyday occurrence instead of a single event in the remote past. In other words, when there was that little bang of consciousness. It would appear that the mind of a human being must develop from something of the nature of mind in the fertilized egg, and back of this, in the separate germ cells and the nucleic acid molecules. So you've got this magical, miraculous occurrence in every single pregnancy. You know, first of all, there's no mind at all, and then at some stage, one thinks it must be, if you accept the difference of mind and matter, it must be at some point in time, like an instant in time, a baby, an embryo, suddenly gains basic form of sentience. Maybe that, obviously that gets more complex as it grows, as a child grows after it's been born as well. But nonetheless, there must be, if you're an emergentist, a point at which an embryo becomes sentient. And he says that's just hard to believe, you know? Is it not rather better to think that sentience was always there in lesser degrees? So even, you know, the first fusion of the sperm and egg doesn't have, that itself has it's very primitive matter, well, primitive and primitive, but it would be an equally primitive form of mind. And it's not like it's just physical and then suddenly sentience pops into existence. Rather, it's just a gradual degree of the development of sentience. Another related criticism from William James, from his book Principles of Psychology, 1890, which basically created the modern field of psychology as we know it. Again, he's arguing that the emergence of any mind, not just human mind, from matter is simply magic, miracle. So he writes this, quote, consciousness, however small, however simple it is an illegitimate birth in any philosophy that starts without it, and yet professes to explain all facts by continuous evolution. If evolution is to work smoothly, consciousness in some shape must have been present at the very origin of things. So you've got a contrast here between emergentism and panpsychism, which we'll look at in a future week. It's either the view that, first of all, there's physicality without any mind, and then one day, or one time instant, sentience emerges from that. And not only in the distant past, but, you know, every day with pregnancy. And actually at every single moment, the mind emerges synchronously from the brain. do you believe that, or do you believe that there was never a time in the past where there was no mind? There was always mind with matter, or matter and mind might be the same thing. And thus, we don't have this problem of like novelty emerging out of non-novelty, this magic emergence. Rather, we just have a continuous evolution, as he says, of mind matter, mind stuff, as he calls it. He seems to think, William James seems to think this is much more parsimonious, much more beautiful explanation of the relationship between mind and matter than emergentism. Friedrich Paulsen makes the same case, quote, "Whence did psychical, mental life arise? Is the first feeling in the first protoplasmic particle something absolutely new, something that did not exist before in any form of which not the slightest trace was to be found before? That, of course, would be an absolute world riddle. It would mean a creation out of nothing." So here we have scientists, philosophers, trying to use science against emergentism, which is the general view of scientists today, right? So it would be like completely crazy, they argue, to think that mind can come out of non-mind. It would be a complete, like a miracle. It would be like a singularity. It'd be a bit like the Big Bang, you know, give me one miracle and I give you everything else. Now, here's something I've mentioned before, but you have to think about it in a bit more detail. It's Mary's room again, right? So this is, let's see if you follow this. So the knowledge argument, Mary's room, if you remember now what I said about her. She's never seen red until she steps out, but she knows all about redness physically. The knowledge argument contradicts, goes against emergentism's claim of being non-reductive physicalism, because the knowledge argument to which emergentism leads via novelty, you know, via like C.D. Broad's archangel, irreducibility, theoretical unpredictability, like we can't predict the redness from a brain, you know, theoretically unpredictable. So the knowledge argument to which emergentism leads itself leads to the refutation of physicalism. But emergentism started out by saying it was physicalist. So it's like a vicious circle. It's like an Ouroboros, one of those snakes that eats its own tail. Does emergentism self-implode? So there's a like multi-step criticism. Any counter criticisms to that? How do you think you might be able to defend emergentism against that?
Maybe science hasn't gotten far enough to depict qualia. Maybe, you know, through virtual reality or whatever in the future, maybe we can do that, and then that way, like it can, then that solves itself.
So you mean if science develops so that we will be able to explain the emergence of red, like we will know what red is, like the vision of it itself, by looking at the physical, then there wouldn't be a refutation of physicalism, and therefore emergentism would survive as a physicalist doctrine. Yeah, okay. This is actually the path that Daniel Dennett takes. Don't know if you've heard of this philosopher. He's very, very popular. And he's written a lot about it. There was a really nasty argument between him and John Searle, I believe, about this and other things. There's so much written about this room that it's like, you know, you can drive you mad. But anyway, yeah, if science develops, but of course that means it's not scientific as we know science today. And do you remember we looked at Hempel's dilemma last time with me, which is the view that physicalism is either what current science knows now, but we know that's not good enough because it's incomplete, relativity, quantum physics, and so on, or it means that the physical means what physics will ideally in the future know, a completed physics. But the problem with that is that would mean that we don't know what the physical is today because we are not in the future. Either way, it's very hard to say what the physical is, and therefore, like believing in science would be like a faith option. Now, the major criticism of emergentism really is mental causation. That's what we're going to look at in detail on Thursday. So it's like free will, these big philosophical questions. Mental causation is a type of downward causation. Is arguably, because you can use downward causation for example, like I don't know, like a hurricane as a macro property can have downward causation on the little particles within it, right? But mental causation is a type of downward causation. It's arguably the biggest threat to emergentism. We'll see why soon. But basically, it's because if emergentism is a physicalist doctrine, then physicalism can't accept mental forces very well. Also, there are problems of overdetermination, transgression of causal closure, blah, blah. You'll understand what that means on Thursday at the end of the day. But so I'll save that until then. But note that mental causation, it's like you can't live with it and you can't live without it, It's a really, really big problem. And it's related to the interaction problem because it's like one form of interaction. Again, you can think of mental causation as downward causation, and you can think of emergence as outward causation. These are the two main problems of the mind matter problem, really. Two of the main problems. Okay. Oh shit, we've run out of time. But just to remind you, there are the options. Those are the 5 features we've looked at then. Yeah, that's it. Time's up. So thank you for your time. I know there's there's some complex issues here with emergence, but just dwell on them. The PDF is on the Ellie page. Go through the slides again, read the paper, read the readings, and like I say, Thursday we'll have the other aspect of it, epiphenomenalism and mental causation, which will make sense, should make more sense of it all. Any final questions before we leave? Okay, I'll see you on Thursday in the normal room, right in person, just like normal. Okay, thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers, bye.